supermarket checkout line moved at its usual sluggish pace when the elderly man in front of Sarah collapsed, clutching his chest. While others froze in panic, something extraordinary happened. The quiet woman behind him didn't hesitate for even a second. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had saved lives before, her voice cutting through the chaos with military authority. "Call 911 now. Clear this area and get me the AED from customer service." What nobody knew was that Sarah Martinez wasn't just another suburban mom doing her weekly shopping. She was a decorated Blackhawk pilot whose reflexes had been forged in the most dangerous combat zones of Afghanistan, where split-second decisions meant the difference between bringing her crew home alive or in body bags. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Martinez pushed her cart through the narrow aisles of Henderson's Market, just another face in the Tuesday afternoon crowd. She moved with an efficiency that most people attributed to being a busy mom, grabbing items with purposeful precision, checking her list twice, avoiding eye contact with chatty neighbors who might delay her schedule. What they didn't see was the constant situational awareness that had kept her alive through 47 combat missions over the mountains of Afghanistan. Her eyes automatically cataloged exits, assessed potential threats, and tracked movement patterns of everyone around her. This hypervigilance had become second nature during her 8 years as a Blackhawk pilot, and despite being stateside for 3 years now, she couldn't turn it off. The checkout line stretched longer than usual, filled with customers clutching their weekly essentials. Sarah found herself behind an elderly gentleman wearing a faded navy baseball cap, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he counted out exact change for his modest grocery. Eerie's. She noticed his labored breathing, the slight sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the store's aggressive air conditioning, and the way he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. These were details that most people would miss, but Sarah's training had taught her to read physical indicators like a second language. Something wasn't right. The man fumbled with his wallet, dropping several coins that scattered across the linoleum floor. As he bent to retrieve them, Sarah saw the pain flash across his features, a grimace that spoke of more than simple embarrassment. Her military instincts began firing warning signals, but she maintained her civilian facade, offering a gentle smile as she helped gather the fallen change. "Thank you, dear," he wheezed, his voice strained. "Getting old isn't for the weak, that's for sure." Sarah handed him the coins, noting the clamminess of his skin and the irregular rhythm of his pulse visible in his neck. Every fiber of her being wanted to assess his condition properly, but she was just another shopper in line, not Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, decorated combat pilot and trained medic. The elderly veteran, she was certain now that he was military, recognizing the bearing despite his obvious distress, finally completed his transaction and began shuffling toward the exit. Sarah watched him go, her concern growing with each labored step he took. She was debating whether to approach him when it happened. 3 steps past the automatic doors, he stopped abruptly, his hand flying to his chest. The paper bag of groceries slipped from his grasp, canned goods clattering across the pavement as he staggered backward, his face draining of color. For a split second, the world seemed to freeze. Other shoppers continued their conversations, oblivious to the crisis unfolding just yards away. The teenage cashier was focused on scannies, barcodes, her earbuds blocking out everything except her playlist. Even the customers who noticed the fallen groceries assumed it was just another clumsy accident. But Sarah saw what they missed. The textbook signs of cardiac arrest playing out in terrifying real time. The man's eyes rolled back, his knees buckled, and he began falling toward the unforgiving concrete. This was the moment when Sarah Martinez, suburban mom and secret war hero, had to make a choice. She could remain anonymous, call 911 like any other concerned citizen, and hope someone else would step forward with medical training. Or she could drop the carefully constructed civilian identity she'd maintained for 3 years and become the officer who had pulled wounded soldiers from burning aircraft, who had performed emergency medical procedures at 10,000 feet while under enemy fire, who had never lost a crew member under her command. The choice was made before her conscious mind could even process it. Years of military training obliterated 3 years of civilian restraint in the span of a heartbeat. Sarah's cart crashed into a display of cereal boxes as she sprinted toward the collapsing man, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the parking lot with unmistakable authority. "Call 911 now!" she barked at a stunned woman loading groceries into her SUV. "Tell them we have a male, approximately 70 years old, cardiac arrest in progress at Henderson's Market parking lot." She dropped to her knees beside the unconscious veteran, her hands automatically moving to check his pulse and airway with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these exact motions under the most extreme conditions imaginable. His pulse was weak and thready, his breathing shallow and irregular. Sarah tilted his head back, cleared his airway, and began chest compressions with the precise rhythm she'd learned during combat medic training. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. "Yes," she muttered, falling into the familiar cadence that had saved lives in helicopter cabins while bullets pinged off the fuselage around her. The crowd that had initially ignored the emergency now pressed closer, drawn by the authoritative voice and professional medical response they were witnessing. Sarah was dimly aware of their presence, but her focus remained laser-locked on her patient. "Someone get me the AED from customer service," she commanded without looking up from her compressions. "And I need this area cleared. Give us room to work." Her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, someone whose orders in crisis situations had once meant the difference between life and death for entire military units. A store manager appeared at Sarah's shoulder, holding the automated external defibrillator with shaking hands. I don't know how to use this," he stammered, his face pale with panic. Sarah looked up at him for the first time, and he saw something in her eyes that made him step back, the calm, deadly serious gaze of someone who had faced far worse situations and emerged victorious. "I do," she said simply, taking the device and efficiently attaching the electrode pads to the elderly man's chest with movements so smooth and practiced that it was clear this wasn't her first life-or-death emergency. The AED analyzed the heart rhythm while Sarah continued rescue breathing, her military bearing now impossible to disguise. She knelt with the straight-backed posture of an officer, her voice remained steady and authoritative, and her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed medical procedures in combat zones. The growing crowd of onlookers began to whisper among themselves, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a good Samaritan with basic first aid training, but someone with serious medical and crisis management experience. When the paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, they found a scene of textbook emergency response. Sarah had not only stabilized the patient, but had also organized the bystanders into an efficient support system, someone directing traffic around the emergency vehicles, another person gathering the man's scattered groceries and personal effects, and a third keeping the crowd at a respectful distance. She delivered her patient handoff report with military precision. Male, approximately 70, sudden cardiac arrest witnessed at 14:37 hours. Initial rhythm was ventricular fibrillation, converted to normal sinus after one shock. He's been down approximately 8 minutes, received continuous CPR with 2-minute cycles. Pulse is weak but regular, respirations assisted. No obvious trauma, appears to be primary cardiac event. The lead paramedic, a grizzled veteran himself, studied Sarah's face as he took over patient care. Something in her bearing, her terminology, and her absolute composure under pressure told him this woman had military medical training. "You military?" he asked quietly as they loaded the elderly man onto the stretcher. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "Army, Blackhawk pilot." The paramedic's eyebrows rose slightly. He knew enough about military aviation to understand that Blackhawk pilots didn't just fly aircraft, they were trained in combat medicine, tactical rescue operations, and crisis leadership. "Well, ma'am, you just saved this gentleman's life. Professional work." As the ambulance pulled away with its stabilized patient, Sarah found herself standing in the Pisab parking lot, surrounded by a crowd of neighbors and strangers who were all staring at her with newfound respect and curiosity. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the emergency was beginning to fade, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that her carefully maintained anonymity had just been shattered. For 3 years, she had been just another resident of this small town, keeping her military service and combat experience hidden from a community that she feared might not understand the weight of what she had seen and done. Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's elderly mother who worked part-time at the customer service desk, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "That was Bill Morrison. she said, her voice thick with emotion. He's been shopping here for 20 years, ever since his wife passed. He doesn't have any family left. She grasped Sarah's hands with surprising strength. You saved him, dear. You brought him back to us. The simple gratitude in the old woman's eyes was almost harder to bear than the chaos of the emergency itself. Sarah tried to deflect the attention, gathering her scattered groceries and attempting to blend back into normalcy, but it was too late. Word was already spreading through the small community like wildfire. The quiet woman who lived in the blue house on Maple Street, who kept to herself and never talked about her past, was actually a decorated military officer who had just performed a miracle in the Henderson's Market parking lot. Her phone began buzzing with text messages from neighbors who had either witnessed the event or heard about it through the lightning-fast, small-town gossip network. That evening, as Sarah sat in her kitchen trying to process the day's events, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. For years, she had struggled with the transition from military to civilian life, missing the sense of purpose and the clear mission objectives that had defined her existence for nearly a decade. She had hidden her service record not out of shame, but out of a desire to spare her new community the burden of her war stories and the expectations that came with being a combat veteran. Now, whether she liked it or not, that choice had been taken away from her. The local newspaper called that night, followed by the regional television station, all wanting to interview the hero pilot who had saved a life at the grocery store. Sarah declined them all, but she knew the story was already beyond her control. In a town of 8,000 people, news traveled fast, and by morning everyone would know that Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, former Blackhawk pilot and decorated war veteran, was living quietly among them. The question now was whether she was ready to embrace the visibility that came with being recognized for who she truly was, rather than hiding behind the comfortable anonymity she had cultivated since leaving the service. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's front door. Bill Morrison stood on her porch looking remarkably healthy for someone who had been clinically dead less than 24 hours earlier. He was flanked by a man in his 50s wearing a Marine Corps veteran baseball cap and a woman with the unmistakable bearing of former military. Colonel Martinez, Bill said formally, offering a crisp salute that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. I'm here with members of the local VFW post to thank you properly for saving my life and to ask if you'd consider joining our family. The word family hung in the air between them, carrying weight that only veterans could fully understand. Sarah had spent 3 years feeling isolated from the civilian community, unable to relate to their concerns about grocery prices and school board meetings when her mind was still processing the memories of mortar attacks and casualty evacuations. She had convinced herself that her military experience was something to be hidden, a chapter of her life that needed to be closed and locked away to avoid making others uncomfortable with the realities of what she had seen and done in service to her country. But standing there on her porch, looking into the faces of fellow veterans who understood the weight of command, the responsibility of life and death decisions, and the struggle of transitioning from military to civilian life, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the service, a sense of belonging. These weren't people who would be uncomfortable with her war stories or intimidated by her military bearing. They were family, bound together by shared experiences and mutual understanding that transcended the superficial connections of neighborhood barbecues and PTA meetings. I'd be honored, Sarah replied, her voice steady but emotional. Bill Morrison's face broke into a wide grin and he reached into his jacket to pull out a VFW membership application. We meet every Thursday night at 7, he said. Nothing fancy, just coffee and conversation with people who get it. The Marine Corps veteran stepped forward and extended his hand. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, retired, served 3 tours in Iraq before they sent me home. Been looking forward to meeting you ever since word got out about yesterday. The woman beside him offered her own introduction. Chief Warrant Officer Jennifer Walsh, Army Aviation, retired, flew Chinooks in Afghanistan for 6 years. We don't get many fellow pilots in our little group. Sarah felt an unexpected surge of relief at meeting another female combat pilot. Someone who would understand not just the challenges of military aviation, but the additional pressures of being a woman in a male-dominated field. The isolation she had felt for 3 years was beginning to crack, replaced by the warm recognition of shared experience and mutual respect. As news of Sarah's military background continued to spread through the community, the response was overwhelmingly positive. The high school principal called to ask if she would speak to students about military service and leadership. The local Rotary Club extended an invitation for her to be their keynote speaker at the annual Veterans Day dinner. Parents began approaching her at the grocery store, the same grocery store where she had saved Bill Morrison's life, to ask about military career paths for their children and to express gratitude for her service. Most surprising of all was the reaction from other residents who had been quietly living with their own military backgrounds. A retired Air Force colonel emerged from his self-imposed anonymity to introduce himself, followed by a former Navy SEAL who had been working as a local contractor and a Vietnam veteran who had spent decades avoiding conversations about his service. Sarah's public emergence as a military hero had created a ripple effect, encouraging other veterans to step forward and connect with their community in ways they had previously avoided. The Thursday night VFW meeting that Sarah had committed to attending became a turning point in her civilian life. The modest meeting room above Murphy's Tavern filled with more veterans than had gathered in years, all drawn by word of mouth about the decorated Blackhawk pilot who had joined their ranks. Sarah found herself sharing stories she had kept locked away for years, describing the challenges of flying medical evacuations under fire and the weight of command responsibility when every decision affected the lives of her crew and the soldiers they were rescuing. In return, she heard stories from Marines who had fought in Fallujah, sailors who had served on nuclear submarines during the Cold War, and Army medics who had treated casualties in Vietnam. The common thread that bound them all together was the understanding that military service changes you fundamentally, creating a perspective on life, death, duty, and sacrifice that civilians, despite their best intentions, could never fully comprehend. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt truly understood. The transformation in Sarah's civilian life was remarkable. Instead of hiding her military background, she began incorporating it into her daily interactions with purpose and pride. She volunteered to help local veterans navigate the VA healthcare system, drawing on her experience as a field-grade officer who understood military bureaucracy. She organized a monthly breakfast meeting for female veterans in the area, creating a support network that had been desperately needed but never established. Most importantly, Sarah discovered that her military experience, rather than being something to hide from her civilian community, was actually a valuable gift she could offer. Her crisis leadership skills, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her training in emergency medical procedures weren't burdens to be concealed. They were assets that could benefit everyone around her. The grocery store emergency had implied been the catalyst that revealed what had been true all along. Heroes don't stop being heroes when they take off the uniform. They just find new ways to serve. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez had spent 3 years trying to disappear into civilian anonymity, convinced that her military service was a chapter to be quietly closed rather than celebrated. But sometimes life has other plans, and a moment of crisis can reveal truths that we've been hiding from ourselves as much as from others. When Bill Morrison collapsed in that supermarket parking lot, Sarah's instinctive response didn't just save a life. It saved her own sense of purpose and belonging. The small town that had unknowingly harbored a war hero discovered that military veterans aren't broken warriors to be pitied or dangerous individuals to be feared. They are neighbors, friends, and family members who carry within themselves extraordinary training, unshakable dedication to service, and a willingness to step forward when others step back. Sarah's emergence from the shadows encouraged an entire community of veterans to reconnect with each other and with their civilian neighbors, creating bonds of understanding and mutual respect that strengthened everyone involved. Today, Sarah serves her community in uniform once again, not the digital camouflage of combat deployment, but the simple name tag of a volunteer EMT with the local fire department. She has found a way to honor her military training while serving her civilian neighbors, proving that once a hero, always a hero, regardless of the setting or circumstances. If this story of hidden military heroism and community service has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of veterans who continue to serve long after their military careers have ended. Share this video with someone who might need to be reminded that heroes walk among us every day, and that military service is something to be celebrated, not hidden. Honor our veterans by recognizing their continued contributions to your communities, and remember that the uniform may come off, but the heart of a warrior beats on forever.